Invocation. Towards the One, the perfection of love, harmony, and beauty, the only being, united with all the illuminated souls who form the embodiment of the Master, the Spirit of guidance. I'll start with a Sufi story and then I'll pause the recording so we can hear from all of you. But here's what occurred to me, seeing those of you who are showing up for a Sufi intro conversation and knowing that at least I'll say half of you probably have more experience with Sufism than I do, and half of you probably don't. So it reminded me of a story of Mullah Nasruddin, who is a Sufi jokester and a wisdom keeper, wisdom implementer, but often plays out wisdom in very silly ways. So in this story, Mullah Nasruddin is an illustrious, respected teacher on the teaching circuit, meaning that he's traveling around and giving teachings and talks in different centers and mosques and temples. And he shows up in this particular community one lovely morning and says, "Hello, friends. I'm so honored and grateful to be here with you today. And do you know what I'm about to say?" And they said, "Oh, yes." And he said, "Well, then I don't need to say anything. Thank you very much. Have a good day." And he left. The next week, he showed up again and said, "Hello, friends. I'm so grateful and honored to be here. And do you know what I'm about to say?" And they said, "Oh, no. Oh, no, we have no idea." And he said, "Well, then I won't be able to help you. Have a nice day." And he left. And then the third week, he came back and he said, "Hello, friends. I am so honored and grateful to be here. And do you know what I'm about to say?" And half of the group said yes. And half of the group said no. And he said, "Well, then those of you who know can tell those who do not. Have a nice day." And he left. So that seems like a good place to start. We can pause the recording and hear from each of you, and half of you can tell the other half everything about Sufism. It is a beautiful magic about Sufism that people find it in so many very strange ways. And that there are some people who seek it out on purpose. They hear the word, they hear something about it, and they go looking for it with great determination. And others, it falls in their lap or just like smacks them in the face over and over again. And they're like, wow, I guess I have to pay attention to this stuff. So, however it is that people find Sufism and that very adorable word is perfectly fine, and there's no right way or wrong way of falling into the lap of the lineage. There are a confusing amount of expressions of different Sufi lineages, and they are not just major traditions that have tens of thousands of followers, um, but also very tiny little esoteric schools. And each Sufi school, each Sufi tariqa, which is a school or a particular system of training, has its own culture, its own leadership, its wisdom teachings and practices and ways of training murids. There's another weird word. So a murid is an initiated student. It is someone who has chosen intentionally, deliberately to participate and step deliberately with confidence into the Sufi system, a Sufi school of training, the care and guidance of a Sufi teacher, a particular Sufi community. So a murid is a student. And there are a few different words that are used for a teacher that include a sheikh, a murshid, a peer, khalif, and there are different pronunciations and different spellings of those because these words and terms wander into different languages, different cultures, different nationalities, and adopt the flavor and expression of different places and people. So there is a central tenet, I'm going to call it a central tenet in Sufism, that is about the teacher and student relationship. That is a direct connection between a teacher and a student that happens through a ritual, a ceremony of initiation. Of it is sometimes called bayat, which means a promise or an oath that is a choice made with confidence and a commitment that is taken on. In the way that Inayat Khan, my Sufi hero, who is in this picture over here, my left, I don't know how it looks to you, but it's to my left in my experience right now. The way that he talked about initiation is that there was no preparation necessary, that there is no amount of study or knowledge or attainment that needs to be accomplished before someone can choose to be initiated, because initiation in the word itself means that it is the beginning point. It is the starting point. To initiate something is to start something. And so that means that you don't know what you're getting into, that you don't have a body of knowledge and wisdom accumulated. And if you do have a body of knowledge and wisdom accumulated, the initiation is a willingness to throw all that up in the air, to go, maybe that means something or maybe not, but there's a softening of the attachments and clinging to the thought constructs, the belief systems, the patterns, not just of the way that we think about the world and ourselves, but also about what we identify with, what we have taken great confidence in, and where we've put our trust in life to this point. Murshid describes this as Murshid, meaning teacher, and that's the title that I use for Inayat Khan. So if I say Murshid, that's who I mean. Different people mean different entities, but I mean Inayat Khan. Murshid talks about the process of life itself, that is all about, from the very beginning, from birth into and through childhood, into and through adolescence, into at least early adulthood, if not middle adulthood, is all a process of learning that is about accumulating experiences and information that helps us navigate the world, that is our relationships and responsibilities, the tasks of everyday life. And that also is about how we identify ourselves, identify with our needs, our desires, our preferences and aversions. And at some point, we, if we're progressing onward, developing, maturing, we reach a point where we become aware that all that we have learned, all that we have developed in our life in this world of limitation is limitation. And there is something that is infinite, powerful, beautiful, that is absolute freedom beyond the constructs of this limited existence. And when we become aware of that, we begin the spiritual journey, which is what Murshid calls a process of unlearning, which doesn't mean that we forget anything that we've learned. It means that we learn to question it. It means that we are open to receiving perspectives, information, experiences that contradict, that complement, that balance out, that uproot, that soften our attachment to what we had previously learned. Okay, I'm going to speculate and say there are hundreds of Sufi schools, of Sufi tariqas, of systems of training that call themselves Sufi. And Sufism is fundamentally, it is not fundamental, it is not fundamentalism, but it is basically, like, at its foundation, at its core, Sufism is the pursuit of wisdom, which Murshid comes back to describing the word Sufi, that is tied to roots in the Arabic and Persian languages that have to do with wisdom. That he also ties it to the word Sophia in Christian or Greek language, that means holy wisdom. same root, different language. And so Sufism is a path of pursuing wisdom that is not limited or restricted to any particular faith traditions. So Sufism can exist harmoniously and beautifully, including any of the faith traditions and religious structures of the world. If the person who is engaged in a particular religion is also dedicated to experiencing and cultivating wisdom, then you can bring your faith tradition along. So there are Christian Sufis, Jewish Sufis, Buddhist Sufis, atheist Sufis, pagan Sufis, case in point, Islamic Muslim Sufis, Sufis from lots and lots of different faith traditions or a lack of faith tradition, and that's all perfectly fine in this particular form and expression of Sufism. There are also a lot of different tariqas that are more commonly, traditionally Islamic in origin, and not all of them, but a lot of them, including ones that are focused on I can split these into two different categories that are kind of playfully referred to as sober Sufis and drunken Sufis. That is, the sober Sufis are the Sufis that are very serious and solemn in their practices, in their tenets, in their pursuit of ideals in a very serious way. And the drunken Sufis tend to be ones that are not necessarily ridiculous, but that are pursuing wisdom and realization and awakening through delights, through joy, through love, through passionate explorations that includes music and dance and the delights of this world and beyond. So sober and drunken Sufis. Let's see. One other thing before I pause the recording. It is often said that Sufism is the mystical side of Islam. And for a lot of Muslim people and people that are holding and adherent to Islamic practices, that is true. And I would speculate, I can just throw a random number around and say 99.9% of Sufis are probably rooted in Islamic traditions, and some are not. However, because Sufism is sweepingly understood to be mysticism, and mysticism is out of the box. Mysticism is about the direct experience of the divine, the direct experience and relationship with one's own soul. And that cannot be limited to any particular doctrine or religious structure. So Murshid, Inayat Khan, was very explicit in saying there is no such thing as a Christian mystic, a Jewish mystic, or a Muslim mystic. If you are a mystic, you are not beholden to any of the rules and restrictions of religion because you are more interested in the direct experience that it does not have any limitation. So he would describe that definition of the mystical Islam as a misnomer. Okay, I'm going to pause the recording and hear what you got cooking in between. Okay, some great questions and experiences, and so we'll see what we can do here. Well, there's this vast, immense history of Sufism that goes through many, many generations, and lots of kind of poetic expressions or representations about where Sufism started from or came from, and how these different lineage streams and tariqas developed, which is you can find lots and lots of stories, a lot of which contradict each other. And so you can fall into like, well, here's a history and a perspective from one particular tradition that you can just try to get comfortable with that one. But it doesn't give a very broad picture. So I would say the longest possible representation of what Sufism is and where it came from is a kind of a poetic interpretation that says, because Sufism is the pursuit of wisdom, and as mysticism is the direct relationship with God, it is said that the first Sufi was Adam. That was the first human being, because there was a definite need and pursuit of knowing oneself and understanding life and being in direct communion with God in an ongoing way. So that's the longest history I've heard. And there are also things about silsila, that is about the direct chain of transmission, that is an established, documented history of relationships from teacher to student that go through the generations. And those ones, in my understanding and awareness, go back to the Prophet Muhammad as the first human being, though the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings upon him, did not proclaim to be a Sufi. So there's some question about that. But because there's a history of the Prophet Muhammad received the revelation that is the message of the Quran, that is the message of truth and God's instruction for humanity directly from the angel Gabriel, or Jibrail in the Arabic pronunciation of that angel's name. And that was the instruction directly from Allah, from God. Then there isn't a human being to attribute as the direct teacher of the Prophet Muhammad. So he is recognized as the first human being in the silsila of the Sufi tariqas that I'm familiar with. Maybe there are some that don't establish or look at a silsila in that way, but that is my sweeping understanding. Now, we get to go into going through the generations. You can look at a list of all of the names, one person per generation of Sufis, of teachers, not all of them even called themselves Sufis, but that are the wisdom keepers and the holders of responsibility for spiritual training in their tradition. And that these teachers go through the generations and are documented to the Prophet Muhammad, and then all the way through until now. And you can draw these direct connections, hand to hand, person to person, in this lineage containment understanding framework. Inayat Khan, Murshid, my favorite Sufi hero, and that connects me into a particular stream of Sufism. His training was in India. He was born and raised in India, and his teacher was primarily in a Sufi tariqa called the Chishti lineage. And you can find that word spelled different ways as well, but generally you'll see it something like Chishti, Chishti, or if you add a YYA at the end, it means that there's a training, a school, a culture, a tradition of a Sufi lineage stream. So you'll see the suffix, is that the word for it? Yeah, the suffix of IYYA on a lot of different names that are either referencing a particular person or a particular place where a tradition started. So in the Chishti tradition of Sufism that Inayat Khan was initiated in and that his teacher was representing, the Chishti Sufi lineage is most prevalent right now in India, but it actually started back in Persia and then moved. It was established the name, the Chishti lineage stream in Persia, and then it took root in India and exploded in popularity in India for very good reasons, which is the Chishti school is a drunken Sufi school that is very much about ecstasy and devotion and music and dance and feeling the joy and upliftment of the prayer, of practice, of zikr or dhikr, if you prefer that pronunciation. I'll say more about that, I think. So the Chishtiya school really took root in India in the 12th century, and you can trace the history if you want to get very scholarly about it and go, well, it started over here with this person and then came to India here. And in the way that it came to Inayat Khan in his lifetime, which was, he was born in 1882, and he started traveling and teaching in 1910, and then he died in 1927. his teacher, Abu Hashim Madani, was a Chishti Sufi teacher, but he gave instruction in what is called the 4 schools of Sufism. There are a lot more than 4 schools, but there's a recognition of 4 primary schools that are prevalent in India. And each of them has its own particular system of training, but the 4 of them are addressed together because they seem to complement and balance each other's interests and styles of practice. And so they are often, can I say they're bundled together? Well, certainly in Inayat Khan's training, they were bundled together. So those 4 schools are, Chishtiya is one of them, and that's the primary one that his teacher was representing. But there's also the Naqshbandi, there's also the Surawardi, and the Qadri. And so those 4 function together in Murshid's training. And you can see this in the way that he taught Sufism and the way that he trained murids, that he brought in a lot of joyful, ecstatic practices of music, of walking practices, of using the body, postures and gestures, of doing namaz, that is specific forms of movements with prayer practice, and also forms of somber, dedicated, silent meditation and contemplation, and breath practices that are much more yogic. And so you can see a lot of different influences and integrations in his teachings from these different schools of Sufism. Okay. There's a question about American Sufism that is sometimes also referred to as Western Sufism. And I understand why people use that phrasing, because there are some unique characteristics about how murids and Sufi structures function in people who are born, raised, and conditioned in a Western culture. And so there's a way of using that phrase to describe some interesting characteristics about how Sufism functions in the United States or in Western Europe. And I suspect that Murshid would not be a fan of that phrase, because he would say that Sufism is Sufism wherever it is. And it is the responsibility and the function of a Sufi lineage stream of Sufi practices and teachings to shape themselves to meet the needs of the murids in whatever culture, in whatever condition, in whatever moment they happen to be moving. And so every tradition, every culture, every language, every society, every family, every town would have its own way of engaging the practices. Sufism is still Sufism. It is still the study of wisdom and the efforts to understand oneself, to have a direct relationship with the unfolding of the soul, and to function as skillfully and masterfully in one's own life as possible. I recently had the delight of being with an illustrious Sufi teacher named Tasneem Hermila Fernandez, who is part of a sister lineage stream to mine. And someone asked about Western Sufism, and Tasneem was absolutely aghast and said, "You would not say such a thing if you knew what that meant. If you knew the divisions that you were drawing between different Sufi orders when they are all the same thing. The teaching is on unity, on tolerance, of understanding, of recognizing the oneness of everything, and how we separate things out and set up a system of better or less by creating differences and distinctions. Don't do that." All right. One of you mentioned Kabir Helminski and also Mevlevi. These are 2 distinct things, though there are a lot of similarities. So Kabir Helminski is an American man, and he and his wife, Camille, have done a tremendous amount of work in making Sufism accessible for English speakers, part of which has been translating mystical poets, and Rumi, and oh, my brain just stopped. A different Kabir, and oh, there's another one, but it's not in my brain right now. So Kabir Helminski and his wife Camille have also done a lot of translation of Quran, and have taken either the entirety of the Quran or passages of the Quran to help it feel accessible, and to explain the deeper meanings of things, and to invite a contemplative meditation experience and direct relationship with the Quran. So so Kabir Helminski comes through the Jirahi, the lineage stream, which is a Turkish Sufi stream. And so there are a lot of which Rumi and the Mevlevis are also a Turkish Sufi stream. So, but there are differences in the ways that they practice, in the wisdom teachings and the forms of devotion, of prayer. And so two very distinct lineage streams, the Jirahis and the Mevlevis. And all right, that was Kabir Helminski. The Mevlevis come from Jalaluddin Rumi. That is probably the most famous, well-known poet of all time. That might be presumptuous to say, but I think it's true. And so Rumi, Jalaluddin Rumi, lived in Turkey, and he was the person that started this formal practice. I shouldn't say that either. That's incorrect. I'm going to keep correcting myself, because I'm like, well, here's one way of seeing it, but not exactly. So the story is that, now this is story, this is not history, it's just story, is that Rumi was a tremendous, well-respected scholar and teacher, and that he was well known in his community. He had a lot of followers and people that would come to learn from him and study with him. And when this wild dervish, Shams Tabriz, showed up, he, in different ways of expressing it, told Rumi through gesture and word that it was time to stop this scholarly pursuit, and it was time to start experiencing the real. And so Rumi was blown away and put everything aside and went wandering, following Shams, his beloved teacher. Now, there's a story, and maybe it's a lived reality, of Rumi being lost in an ecstatic moment, trance, obsession with the beloved, and holding, in metaphorically or literally, a lamp post on the street with one hand, and having one foot braced against that lamppost and spinning around that lamppost. And the lamppost represents the connection to the divine from the earth plane up into the heavens, the realm of Allah, of God. And in that whirling, he got lost and also connected. That is, losing sight of everyday life and seeing and feeling nothing but that central point of connection to the divine. And that is supposedly, presumably, potentially, where the practice of the whirling dervishes came from. So a dervish, that word, dervish, is a devotee, and it comes from the root that means a door. So it's someone who hangs out in the door just waiting and watching for something to happen. So there's a sense of attention and diligence and devotion that is woven into the word dervish, or darvesh is the same root. So Mevlevi is the name of the Sufi tariqat that traces its inspiration and guidance to the teachings and example set of Jalaluddin Rumi. But it wasn't established as a specific order until after Rumi's death. So who was it that actually established that? I'm not sure. I'm sure I have seen names attributed with that, given that credit, but I don't remember who they are, if it was really clear that there was one person. But Mevlevi as a word comes from the same root as Mevlana or Molana, that are both terms, titles, indications of respect that are given to Rumi. So it is not uncommon to hear him referred to as Mevlana or Molana. So there's a sense of honor to and reverence for the example, the ecstasy, the inspiration that was provided through this particular living being, Jalaluddin Rumi. Pausing the recording again. Coming back to the theme about Western or American Sufism, it's important to note that Murshid Inayat Khan did have some time of traveling and teaching in the United States, but then he also had the majority of his time of traveling and teaching in Europe, mostly Western Europe, and also in Russia. And so he really traveled extensively for 16 years. And he did make multiple trips to the United States to travel and teach in America, but the bulk of his teaching career was in Europe and Russia. So there were the primary centers, the physical centers where Murshid was teaching during his lifetime were in France and Holland. That his family home was established in Suresnes, which is a suburb of Paris, France. And there's still a center, a home, a building, a universal that we'll be visiting actually this fall, a group of us from Sarati Inayat, our Sufi order. And he also established a universal, or like planted the intention to have a universal built in Holland, in Katwijk, that is right on the shoreline, where he had an experience of a powerful illumination, and said that there was a great energy about this space and that there needed to be a universal built on that land. So he held summer schools in Europe, both in France and in Holland, during his teaching career. And he would have a couple months at a time of just having classes, trainings, inviting murids and shirags and the teachers that he empowered and blessed to hold centers, Sufi centers, that were the focus points for sharing teachings and guiding murids and sharing the message of Sufism in different places throughout the world. One of his earliest disciples, his earliest murids, initiated students, was a woman named Ada Martin, who he gave the name Rabia. And she was an American woman who was living in San Francisco at the time. She was Jewish and a very dedicated murid. And after she was initiated by Piro Murshid Inayat Khan, that I believe she was actually initiated in Seattle, Washington, because she missed him in San Francisco. And so she got on a train to go and be with him in Seattle, Washington, and received initiation there. And then she was trained primarily through letter correspondences, through written correspondences. And she, Rabia Martin, became Murshid's first Murshida, that she was given the most senior distinction as the highest recognition of a teacher in the Sufi order that he established. I think that it is beautiful and interesting to note that Murshid's way of shaping and guiding the Sufi path and sharing the message was very intentionally, deliberately focused on empowering women. And in his lifetime, he only gave the distinction of Murshid to 4 people, all women. And all four of them, they were referred to as the four Murshidas, that is, the four established, realized teachers that have the responsibility and the empowerment to guide murids and teach the Sufi message. There were also a lot of people that were given initiations to function as teachers and to lead classes, and people that were ordained as ministers that he called shirags, and also people who were ordained as senior ministers, sirajas. And sirajas are the people who have the responsibility to train and ordain ministers, shirags, in the Sufi order as Murshid established it. Okay, there was something else I wanted to tell you about that. Where is it? Oh, this is not directly related to those things, but I find it charming and adorable, so I'm going to tell you that. Even in Murshid's time, he had a lot of questions coming to him about trying to identify, define the differences between Islam and Sufism. And he was frequently asked if Sufism is Islamic, if it is Muhammadan. And Murshid's response to that was that revelation is the birthright of every soul. That means that the wisdom, the truth, the light of God is available to every human being without distinction, without any particular association with any particular faith tradition. He said the Sufi order that he established and was holding includes members from a lot of different religions, and we do not bother to inquire about anyone's particular faith, whether they have one or not. And some of his students, some of his like respectful murids would come and say to him, well, then, knowing that in general in the world, people think that Sufism is Islam. And Murshid said, Sufism is the path of wisdom. It is the right word for what we are and what we do. And we have to call ourselves something, or they will call us something worse. So he knew that it was a problematic, confusing term, but he was very clear that the essence of the word Sufi and Sufism was the right thing to indicate accurately what our focus is, what our values are, and what we are seeking to accomplish. Okay, then trying to draw a line between specific cultures and Sufism, and the way that Sufism takes on the flavor, the language, the practices, the values of different cultures. That is true for every spiritual tradition I've seen, that it is natural and beautiful and essential that Sufism adapts to the conditions that it is raised in, that Sufism in whatever place in the world will function with the language that is effective for the people in that place. And the forms of practice and the ways that people relate to the spiritual hierarchy and the ways that people work with their own ego motives and worldly value systems and morals and ethics are all going to be unique to each culture. And there is no need or even possibility of drawing a line between them. I'll give a parallel example that it is generally understood. I don't know if it's generally understood. It is a common understanding, maybe that's better, that Buddhism, being a path of compassion and honoring all sentient beings, respecting all sentient beings, it is common for Buddhism to be vegetarian, because there's a desire not to cause harm to any living being. And when I was visiting Thailand, which Buddhism is everywhere in Thailand, and uh, meat as a staple of the diet is also everywhere in Thailand. It is really almost impossible to find vegetarian food in Thailand. And I asked my brother's beloved girlfriend partner how that works, that there is so much meat eating and so much Buddhism. And she described it so simply that Buddhism came in as a spiritual training and framework in an existing culture of meat eaters. And you cannot come in and try to rid a culture of its basic practices and lifestyle and resources because of another tradition that shows up. They need naturally to find a harmonious integration and to compromise and meet each other and shape each other. And that's part of the beauty of the process. Okay, the formation of Sufi orders is such an interesting thing. These happen in all kinds of different ways. That some Sufi orders, tariqas, lineage streams, go through a bloodline that is like from the father to the son, and some of them go from teacher to the most attuned, dedicated murid will inherit the responsibility of a Sufi order, or and also in Sufism, not all the traditions, but a lot of them have an understanding that murids, students, are trained to a certain level of attainment, of capacity, of integration, of understanding, wisdom, um, and then they are empowered and blessed and encouraged to go out and start doing their own thing and teaching and working with their own students and creating their own communities to serve. So, and there are probably variations on any of those themes. The way that Murshid started in a formal organization of the Sufi message that he was teaching, that started very free form, that he would just go and speak to people in public and give public lectures in various places across the country, lots of different countries. And eventually he realized that it was necessary to create an organizational structure to formally set up this school of Sufism. And originally he called it the Sufi order. And my timing on this is a little bit squishy. I think that it was approximately 1916 that he set up the Sufi order as an organization, saying, we have our systems, we have our leadership body, we have our ways of making decisions, we have our sense of purpose, our mission statement, our ways of functioning and providing what resource we can to the world. Then he went to Europe. So that was in the United States that he officially established the Sufi order. Then he went to Europe, and while he was in Holland, he established it as like articles of incorporation, and he called it the Sufi movement. So he changed the name of it in, I believe it was 1917, so the following year in Holland, that he set up the Sufi movement. Now, after Murshid died in 1927, there was some confusion and disagreement about how the leadership should carry on. In a lot of places and a lot of people's awareness, it felt very clear that Murshid intended for Rabia Martin to be his successor, but he did not put that in writing, and he didn't formalize or publicly name her as his successor. So when she then showed up in Holland ready to assume responsibility for the Sufi movement, Murshid's brothers and cousin, some men in the Sufi movement, rejected her and did not want her to hold responsibility, and said that she was very welcome to continue her work and service to the Sufi movement in the United States and other places, that they respected her work, but were not going to acknowledge her leadership of the Sufi movement. So instead, the brothers and the cousin each took approximately a 10-year tenure of leading the Sufi movement in Europe. That was the beginning of divisions that happened. That here's Murshid's Sufi message and the system of training and this body of work that was well documented with 14 Sufi message volumes and lots of systems and curriculum. And so Rabia Martin came back to the United States and continued her work and continued to serve the Sufi movement for several years before she went off and started doing her own work in a different way. At some point in about 15 years after Murshid's death, his older son, Vilayat, also went to the Sufi movement leaders and said that he, now approximately 30 years old, felt that he was prepared and ready to take on the mantle of leadership of the Sufi movement that his father had established. And again, the brothers and cousins said that they didn't want to give him that leadership or didn't feel that he was ready. So Vilayat then also came back to the United States in the state of New York and he reclaimed the name, the Sufi order, and started doing his own teaching and organization of curriculum and leadership under his own auspices, carrying the lineage and the work of his father. Eventually, Murshid's younger son, Hidayat, assumed responsibility of the Sufi movement in Holland that was mostly functioning in Europe, but also has centers and leaders around the world. And there have been many divisions and many different teachers, leaders, family members, initiated, empowered Sufis that have felt a strong calling to establish and share the message in their own ways, with the practices and the forms of instruction that feel most meaningful and relevant for them individually and for the communities that they serve. So there are so many of these now, I have lost track, but here are some that I am familiar with. So we still have the Sufi movement is still functioning, mostly in Holland. The Sufi order that was started by Vilayat then was changed. The name of it has changed a couple of times, with Vilayat's son, Zia, who is currently the pir, the head of what used to be called the Sufi order, but is now called the Inayatiyya. That is going back to that tradition of naming a particular tariqa after the person who established it. So Inayatiyya, yeah. There's also the Sufi Contact, which is mostly in Holland, but also around the world, a very small, very loosely held organization. There's one called the Sufi Way that is mostly headquartered in Boulder, Colorado, that has Pir Elias is currently the head of the Sufi Way. There's the Sufi Message, Love, Harmony, and Beauty, that is being held by Murshida Nouria, and she was working with the Sufi movement and was a joint leader of the Sufi movement for a few years after Hidayat's death, actually before Hidayat's death, because, well, I don't need to go into all of that, but she was in a position of highest leadership there. And then she also left and started working under her own auspices. She is currently in Florida and still serving the Sufi message beautifully. There's the Sufi Universal Fraternal Institute that was formed by Adia Rabia Ana Perez, that was also a Sufi movement teacher. There is the Sufi Ruhaniyat that was established by Murshid Sam, Sufi Ahmed Murad Chishti, who was an early disciple of Inayat Khan and who was working with Murshida Rabia Martin for a lot of years. And that is the order that I started in. So I'll come back to that one. There's also headquartered in Boulder, Colorado, there's an interesting, they're all interesting, but there's an order called the Inayati Maimuni order, which is a combination of Sufism and Hasidic Judaism that was formed by Reb Zalman Schachter Shalomi and his student and then co-leader, co-founder of the Inayati Maimuni, that is Pir Netanel Miles Yepes, who is still in Boulder and still holding that concentration. There's the Sufi path of awakening, which used to be called the Fraternity of Light. I'm sorry, he recently changed the name of that one, that was started by a Sufi that was in the Inayatiyya, in the Sufi order at the time, named Amin Mako, and his successor is Moinuddin Christopher Clark, who is still holding that order and recently changed the name of it to the Sufi Path of Awakening. He's a very dear friend of mine. I love him very much. And now I believe the youngest of the Inayati Sufi orders is the order that we established 2 years ago, that is Sirati Inayat Interfaith Sufi Path. And this is the order that I invited a bunch of people to help me shape 2 years and 3 months ago now, which is when I decided that I needed to leave the Sufi Ruhaniyat for lots of good reasons, and that it was necessary for me to have a separate organization to be able to do my work. That is a lot of guiding murids and also training shirags, that is training ministers, which I started doing all of those forms of work and service for the Sufi message under the umbrella of the Sufi Ruhaniyat, which is was my home Sufi community for about 20 years, and now we're functioning in a different way. So Sirati Inayat as a Sufi order, and legally it functions as a church that is more of an American United States legal government structure as a nonprofit, and that has the capacity and the legal rights to be able to train and ordain ministers that are spiritual leaders that can provide services to their communities. We, as Sirati Inayat, are very intentionally interfaith and universal Sufi, meaning that we welcome and celebrate all the faith traditions of the world. And we established our leadership body to reflect the activities that Murshid had originally woven into the Articles of Incorporation for the Sufi movement that he established. That includes the esoteric school, which is the path of initiation and guidance direct from teacher to student, and that goes through a course of study and engaging with Murshid's teachings and a bunch of specific practices that are given according to the individual murid's needs and the individual teacher's inspiration, a spirit of guidance. There's also the Universal Worship Service, and that is the path of ministry and the interfaith ceremony that Murshid shaped, that we hold as a beautiful foundational practice. There is the healing ray, which was one of the expressions of the Sufi movement that Murshid established, and kinship, that is the path of friendship. That Murshid said that Sufism is the path of friendship, that is about us trying to understand each other, develop tolerance, and to treat all human beings as our brothers and sisters. There's also the ray, the activity of Zirat, that is the sacred manuscript of nature, that is attuning to, paying attention to the wisdom and the beauty of nature as the only holy book that can truly enlighten the reader. And then we have also added, this was not part of Murshid's original inspiration, but because of the leadership and the friends that came together to help establish the functions of Sirati Inayat, it felt really critically important for us to have the ray of the divine feminine. That is, we call it the temple of the divine feminine. And also because a lot of us came into Sufism through the route, the channel of the dances of universal peace, that is sacred sound and movement, music, and embodied prayer practice. So we also have a ray for the sacred sound and embodiment that was not a part of Murshid's original inspiration, but is a fundamental aspect of our practice and attunement in Sarati Inayat. So we took a lot of our inspirations from Murshid's teachings and the language that he used to describe the different activities and forms of leadership, and have also used shapes and language and leadership structures that feel relevant and comfortable for the friends that were part of that visioning circle, is what I called that group of us. That were 10 of us that set up all of the foundational systems and structures for Sarati Inayat 2+ years ago.